for downloading this episode of Cork Talk with me, Tim Atkin. A weekly conversation with some of the most famous people in the world of wine. Simon Farr's career in the wine business spans 50 years, a half-century that's seen him work in vineyards, retail, wholesaling and fine wine, as well as investing in a pioneering venture in South Africa. A serial entrepreneur who says he's a very quick learner, eventually, he has strong and well-founded views about Bordeaux and primeur, shifting demographics, and why the younger generation is less scared of wine. Hello, Simon. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Tim. Nice to be here.
It's great to hear your voice. You're in London, I think, aren't you?
I am indeed in Tufnell Park, salubrious Tufnell Park.
That's pretty smart. But you were brought up in Hampstead, weren't you? And a lot more salubrious.
Yeah, more around Hampstead. So I've been coming downhill ever since. But unfortunately, I don't think it's any much lower. I think we could be Holloway or something. But that's coming up so fast that Tufnell Park will probably be left behind.
So, born and brought up in London. Now, I read somewhere that your dad was a journalist. He edited Design magazine in the mid-50s, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. He started, he went to Cambridge after the war. Then he went to the Architectural Press, where he met my mum in the typing pool. And he actually he rewrote a book of Nicholas Pevsner, the art historians, about a mid-century survey of design, which became a bit of a sort of tome and a classic. And then he ended up, that was his sort of segue into editing Design magazine. And then he went off and did his own businesses.
And you never wanted to go into journalism, did you?
No.
Wise move.
I didn't qualify for anything real, so.
And were your parents interested in food and wine?
Not really. The only thing I remember about wine is my grandfather used to bring out the same half bottle of Livre milk every Christmas.
Sounds very glam.
Amongst those brought up in the 50s.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you were about the same as me. I mean, Matisse Rosé for me, I think my parents thought was...
I don't think we got that high.
Yeah, Lutimer, Lasky Riesling.
Yeah, Lutimer, yeah, that was brilliant. Yeah, Lasky Riesling. Yeah.
I mean, you're very modest about your academic achievements. I mean, were you a bad student?
No, I mean, it was Churchill said, I think, about Atliers, and I have a lot to be modest about. But no, I mean, basically, I went to a progressive co-educational boarding school, and they didn't really oblige you to go to lessons much. I remember in my O-level term, I was editing the school magazine, and that was deemed that was much more important. So I'm basically, I think I only graduated in adolescence.
Did you finish your A-levels or not?
No.
Okay. And then, but you went to the University of Aix-en-Provence to study Mandarin, of all things. How did they get in there?
Well, basically what I did was I went to Aix-en-Provence because a girl went there who was rather from school. Very pretty she was too. And so I followed her down there, and then she went off to do her faculté de lettres to do all sorts of proper things. And I decided I got bored sort of kicking around during the day, so I went and enrolled in the faculty for Mandarin, which is about the only thing I could get into without a qualification.
And did you get learned to speak
Mandarin? It was
Mandarin?
great fun. I mean, we sat around. There was a sort of the professor. I don't know if he really was a professor, but he was a sort of Kashmirian would-be revolutionary. And we went through the standard American texts of Mandarin 1968 version or something. And I learned very little, none of which I can remember. So.
Any wine in your life by then? I mean, were you drinking wine in the south of France? You'd been, 18 by then, would you, or 19?
Yeah, it was, yes, exactly about then. And it, no, not really. I mean, you drank anything with alcohol and that was cheap. But, it was for effect rather than for anything else.
Pastis?
So, not really. Yeah, pastis. Well, exactly. Yeah. I mean, whatever was on the bar and cheap, or near Pisserie or whatever. So
sounds like my time in France, really.
No, but wine didn't happen to me until I got the call from parents from a friend in Bordeaux to go to their party, and
Yeah, tell us about that, because as you say, you thought you were going to a party, but it turned up you were going there to do the vintage, right?
Yeah, I think in those days, I think that was a usual wheeze to get people to come and work for nothing. So I turned up, and we ended up doing the Vendage in 1972, which was the first of a string of the most horribly wet vintages.
Exactly.
Because I experienced all of them, and but it was fascinating, really. It was they were very bohemian. She was an archaeologist. She was a retired archaeologist who'd basically been digging up Santorini most of her career. He was a history professor who taught at Stanford, English though.
Yeah.
And they kind of retired there. And so the atmosphere was very bohemian. And we had absolutely no equipment, no idea. I think there was a sort of, well-leafed textbook, probably out of date, and probably for something to do with California. And we basically got by getting the locals to help us out.
Yeah.
And
this was where the Côte de Castillon, wasn't it?
In the Côte de Castillon, yeah. Which is actually, and it made, and it still does, terrifically good, inexpensive wine.
Yeah. And Merlot based, presumably.
Yeah, Merlot based with Cabernet Franc, or Boucher, as they used to call it there. And then, it was really good. And
I mean, what was Bordeaux like in those days? I mean, it sounds pretty primitive. I mean, obviously you weren't working at one of the class growths, but what was it like?
No. It was down a hill, really. I mean, there wasn't very much money about. We were on the edge of Pomerol and Saint-Emilion. But even there was, most of it was pretty down a hill. Everything, it wasn't the sort of glamorous, sort of beautifully architectured place it is today. And they were, Bordeaux was more about, there were more sort of farmers, really. And the chateaux were owned by rich people, but they basically ran them from Paris. And they were very much price takers.
Yeah.
It was a difficult time. And then they made it even more difficult by getting caught, mixing the wrong things in their wine.
And this was the cruise scandal, which was 73, was it?
Yeah. It was 73.
Yeah.
So basically I arrived in sort of the harvest of 72, which was, there was, let's put it this way, an awful lot of jam was made in the Gironde that year. I think we had natural alcohols of about 10. And, so then 73 came along and they, and this whole thing unraveled.
Yeah.
And it took the bottom out of a market that wasn't particularly buoyant anyway. And I remember, after 70 was sort of seen as this great vintage, and then they tried to follow through with 71, and the Americans bought a lot apparently. And then when the sort of 73 scandal broke, they sent most of it back. And so it bankrupted a lot of Bordeaux. And, Cruz lost Pontet-Canet, and eventually the Ginesters lost Margaux.
But you stayed on for 3 years, so you must have been learning something, right?
Yeah, but I mean, we weren't really part of that economy. Yeah. We were really in subsistence farming. We and most of the grapes actually went to the local cooperative at Gardangon. We literally lived day to day, and we had no money. We didn't, it was great for me because I literally learned to do everything with my hands. And we had one ouvrier called Gaillard. He was about 4 foot nothing, and he had 14 children. The 14th of which had Pompidou as his godfather, because he was sort of doing his bit for repopulating France. And we had an Algerian, a Moroccan called Romery, who lived in the pigsties of the local count. And it was there, and we worked in this kind of very simplistic, very sort of hands-on way with no equipment and no idea.
It's brilliant.
Sort of
so 3 years there, and then you went back to London, and you set up 5 shops in London with 2 partners that you describe as a classicist and an ex-fighter pilot. They sound interesting. Tell us a bit more on I think the chain was called Boozy Rouge, wasn't it? Boozy Rouge? Yeah,
well, the one in King's Road, which I lived above, was Boozy Rouge, and it and that was, I think, about the third to come along. And there was one in Sloane Street and one in somewhere off Baker Street, I seem to remember. And they were just a couple of guys who sort of thought that, the wine shops and maybe a wine bar would be a good idea. And I chanced upon them, I think, from a friend of mine who'd just gone to work with Remington Norman at La Reverse, as we used to call it, or La Reserve.
La Reverse.
And and they were looking for somebody basically to do the work. Because the classicist was basically, I think he'd spent most of his time not being a classicist, but chasing after ladies down the King's Road. The fighter pilot was a very good administrator, but he didn't do much front of house. So I basically was sort of young and had no idea and just was up for it. And so,
were you running all 5 shops or just one of them?
Well, sort of. I mean, nobody ran anything really. It was semi-organized chaos. But it was, yeah, and it was interesting, and it was really, I mean, again, I started to realize how, having gone from the sort of understanding how the stuff's grown, I then got into the idea of how do you actually make people want to buy it.
Yeah.
And that was kind of interesting. And there was a lot of trial and error, a lot of error, some, mostly error, should I say.
Yeah. And how did your first real business come about? Because that was called the London Champagne Service. What gave you that idea?
Yeah, well, I mean, since I lived above the Boozy Rouge, I spent a lot of time there. And I remember every Friday there used to be this big Bentley roll-up. And this chap basically filled his boot full of Dom Perignon and Cristal, and then motored off. And I remember one time, I was intrigued, and I sort of got chatting to him. And he basically said he owned a nightclub in Mayfair. And since he only opened at 8:30, none of the champagne houses would deliver to him. So he had to kind of do a pit stop on the way. And so I thought, well, that's really interesting. So I basically we were dealing with Moet and Chandon at the time. It was one of our biggest suppliers. And I remember going to see them and said, listen, what if I actually did this service? And they said, well, that'd be really great, because these guys, I don't know where they get it from, but they said they drink lots of our stuff and at the right end of the portfolio.
Yeah.
And it was the time when all the sort of the Arabs were just bringing all their money from a place where they couldn't drink to a place where they could spend it and drink.
Yeah.
So the clubs were doing a roaring trade. And so I set up this thing, which I think was the first 24/7, I used to call it emergency delivery.
So would you sometimes deliver at 2 a.m?
Yeah. My thing to them is, I said, listen, because they had no space. I said, listen, I will give you the lowest price, but I want cash on delivery. I will deliver it any time of the day and night, so you don't have to plan. You haven't got any space to keep it. And then basically what I used to then do was I would then ring up early in the evening and say, how's it going? How much do you need? And I rarely had to go out past 11 o'clock at night.
Yeah.
But I did everything myself. And in a way, my university was understanding how vines and wineries worked, hands-on, and then doing the same thing by running my first, doing a little bit in this shops, and then doing this business of my own where I did everything.
It was you were a one-man band, right? So you were bookkeeper, van driver.
It was a total one-man band. Yeah. Exactly. Well, I was like 25, and think about it. I was driving around in a white panel van, sort of micro, full of Dom Perignon, Cristal, and Corne de Champagne, and my social life was unbelievable, because amazing. You guess who they used to call when somebody had a party?
I mean, that's a good point. I mean, do you think you're a natural entrepreneur?
I think it's interesting. I think that my education is weird, because it's sort of, I don't know if I was naturally sort of very sort of lateral, but I think, I never really learned to think I never was taught to sort of think in straight lines.
Yeah.
So I think and it made me very curious. And so I've always been interested in, what if you do it this way? And what if we try that? So I've had a natural interest to do that. And it sounds like a bit of a cliche, but I've sort of never really been interested in success. I've been interested in just following a bit of string and seeing where it leads.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, your advice, I read somewhere to somebody, would be to start small with your own resources and do it all, which is what you did, really, wasn't it?
Yes. Yeah. I think it's extremely difficult now.
Yeah.
I think that, because the world is much more complicated. I remember walking into a branch of NatWest, or RBS as it was then, and with basically a half-baked idea and nothing, and sort of saying, I want to start this business, the London Champagne Service, and and I actually, the first thing I could do then, and I can't do now, is I could talk to a bank manager.
Yeah.
And the second thing I can't do today is the bank manager actually had authority, and he had, it wasn't a computer says yes or no.
Yeah.
And so he looked at me, and his face said skeptical, but he's actually said yes.
And gave you the cash.
But he kind of thought, well, he looks like an honest bloke, probably hasn't. This half-baked idea might become one, and he could basically sort of opened an account, and he paid out the overdraft very sort of gingerly, until I kind of proved myself. But nowadays you couldn't do that.
No, that's a good point.
And I think but I do think that, and you just have to get money from friends and family and whatever startup and so on. But I think the answer is start small.
I mean, you sold the business, I think, in 1980, and then you had a little spell in California, and then Majestic Vintners came into your life. Majestic wine warehouses, it became known.
Yeah.
Tell us about Sheldon Grainer. Grana? How do you pronounce his surname?
Grainer. I thought it was like AI, but I think it's NER actually.
Yeah, it's NER, isn't it? I mean, he sounds like a real character, right?
He was. I think on his CV he said he worked for John Lewis. I think he did some show, but in fact, as far as I knew, he was basically a minicab driver from Tottenham, and he was a big sort of hulking guy, and he was into all sorts of things. He had an incredible mind, amazing maths. He just very quick at calculating everything. He traded in stamps. He did all sorts of things, and he loved the idea of wine. I think he liked he loved his food and drink, and that showed. Yeah. And he just saw this as an opportunity. And he'd very much admired Ahmet Pochi, who I do too.
Who was at Oddbins in those days, right?
Yeah. He started Wapping Wine, Ahmet, because he sort of fell out with Dennising and Nick Bale of Oddbins. And he was one of the great mavericks, Ahmet. I mean, he really was a fantastic character.
And what was your job? What was your job at Majestic?
Well, basically, I went there. I didn't go there to get a job. I went there because I wanted to start a fine wine trading business. I had this idea of using the sort of new cheap airlines to go and trade around the world, and I did it once, and I basically did quite well. Except I could never get a hold on stock long enough to really close a deal. So I was looking for somebody, and somebody said, "Well, Sheldon's got this guy called Sheldon Grain. He's got lots of stock." So I went to see him, and I tried to persuade him, to basically give me a line of stock that I could for long enough so I could actually take it around the world. And we got chatting, and he was a really engaging character, and we sort of got on like bouncing ideas around. And he said, "Why don't you come and work with me?" Then he sort of pitched me what he was doing for Majestic, and I sort of said, I said, well, no, I mean, I've really got my idea, and this is what I want to do, and so. But anyway, he said, so let's go for lunch, and he took me off in his green gold-handled Rolls-Royce Corniche convertible.
Not
to
a taxi.
Robert Carrier's in Camden Passage, which was an institution in those days. I don't know if you might be too young for Robert Carrier, but I think he was the first telly chef, actually.
Yeah, no, I remember him. Yeah.
And but we sort of walked, and it was literally like the sort of the sort of tides parting. So he came in. He was obviously a very good customer, and I could see why, because he sat down, and we started with Cristal, went on to Corton Charlemagne 78, followed by 2 bottles of Cheval Blanc 47, which many consider as the greatest wine of the 20th century. Yeah. And then 61. So, and then he sort of pitched during lunch. He was basically all he could do. It was like a thing. I don't know if he really knew if he wanted me. Really, he kind of decided since I was being hard to get, he had to get me.
Yeah. And the business went broke, right? Didn't it?
Well, what happened was that we found out. So there was only really 3 or 4 of us in the sort of the heart of the business, and I was given the job of being strategist. I think it was one of those sort of titles you can't really screw up because it's so impossible to measure. But anyway, so and Tony Mason, who stayed for a long time, a lot of people will know, was running the thing really from an operations point of view. But it had turned out that Sheldon was doing this incredible work with the banks basically to get lines of credit, and he was using this collateral of masses of fine wine, which he basically bought from other brokers, but flipped it instantly, sometimes at a slight loss. But he kept the bond receipts in the good old pre-digital days, and he used to give these wads of paper to the bank, it turned out, and said, well, here's 100,000 worth of stocks, so you can give me another 100 grand credit. And we realized that these were all fraudulent. So we, being directors, we had the fiduciary duty. So we had to go to the bank, and the bank put us into receivership. Yeah.
So how did that job Majestic lead to setting up Bibendum?
Well, basically being the strategist for Majestic, I'd done the sort of deep dive in working out how we could build a modern wine warehouse business. And I looked at the competitive background, and I was seeing that the supermarkets were getting involved in wine, and with Majestic really being in the sort of middle area of the market, I thought, well, we really can't compete with this, because they've got, for supermarkets, wine is a marginal cost. They can tack it on, and it's easy for them to do. They don't have to make it the thing they make their money out of. Whereas for us, it's absolutely central. And also the wine warehouse concept required lots of bricks and mortar, lots of costs, lots of duty paid stock. And I thought, well, the idea is great because it's very sort of democratizing it. It opens up, wine as, for this burgeoning new middle classes. But I thought to myself, well, actually, it's better if we did it for fine wine, because that's the stuffiest end of the trade and it's the one that needs most opening up. And so when we went into receivership, I thought to myself, well, I don't really believe in this majestic thing. That's what led me to sort of think, well, if we reimagine this, we could, we could come up with a better idea. And luckily, somebody who came,
right? You were right.
Well, it worked, yes. And I met this chap, Chris Collins, because he was one of the people that came to look to buy Majestic, and I found him a very intriguing character, very clever and intelligent. Had really sort of interesting insights, and got on with him very well. So when he sort of ended up coming second in that contest, I rang him up the same day and I said, look, I'm sorry you didn't get Majestic, but I've got a better idea.
And he gave you the money, did he? He was a new bank manager.
Well, he said, I went down to see his farm and I gave him a sort of elevator pitch on this. And he said, well, find us a building and I'll back it. Because I hadn't got the money for this sort of thing. And he did. Yeah. And I found him this building eventually in Primrose Hill, having sort of driven halfway around London. And I rang him up and I said, I found this building you're going to buy, Chris. And he said, oh, really? He said, where is it? And I said, Primrose Hill. He said, oh, Chris was the sort of person who'd never seen London. I mean, for him, London was Chelsea. Or he lived in the country, that sort of. So he said, it's folding canvas bath territory. I better bring the Range Rover.
Is that what he said? I remember that it was opposite Kingsley Amis. Occasionally you'd see Kingsley Amis coming back from a London
Kingsley
club.
hadn't moved in by then, but he eventually did, yeah. But Primrose Hill was it became incredibly trendy.
Yeah, yeah.
But in those days, it was actually the famous people there were David Bailey and all the sort of photographers had seen it as a sort of cheap part of London, close to the centre.
God, those were the days. Primrose Hill, cheap.
Indeed, and it was cheap. I mean, we paid $250,000 for a huge building with car parks and, and all the rest of it. Yeah. And it was interesting because it was a very confident statement at the end of the first Thatcher recession.
Yeah.
And we opened up in 1982, which, we opened in July, and, the next harvest was the one that made the modern
Bordeaux
fine wine era kick off, and the name of Robert Parker et al. So we sort of, we often like to think we're geniuses, but timing is usually a huge amount of, to do with it.
Yeah. And you sold that Conviviality 2016. But before you'd left, you'd already bought the fine wine division of Bibendum, hadn't you? And you turned into Cru World Wine 2013 with Jeremy Howard, which is what you're doing now, really. How does that differ from the Bibendum fine wine model, really?
Well, my feeling was that, fine wine trading was going to essentially move much more towards what we were seeing in the financial services area. Yeah. And I think that an awful lot of what the fine wine merchants were doing was not really adding the value that they were having to charge.
Yeah.
And I thought that we had to, we needed a much more of a sort of marketplace model. And eventually that the transparency that we're seeing with the sort of emerging digital world is going to bear down on those sort of dark corners that the intermediaries, occupy. And so I decided from the beginning that, and that's really why Jeremy came on board, is to, that we should create a marketplace and build it. So we use the fine wine, the what we call Cru. We use the fine wine. We started with the fine wine division of Bibendum, turned that into Cru. We then bought a small business in Hong Kong, and then we set about really developing a platform, which we could, and we used the fine wine merchanting business that we had as really our beta testing. So we iterated the platform based on what people actually did, rather than having some big grand plan with, this is how the world's going to be. We decided we'd write this this program effect of this platform.
So pricing has become much more transparent, isn't it, with the internet? Is that the biggest change you've seen since, the early 80s when you started doing Bibendum?
Well, I think that, yes, I think the other thing is that I think that, the biggest change in the last 50 years is I think the rest of the world got rich.
Yeah.
And I think, when I came into the wine trade, it was very much the fine wine world particularly was a few, Northern Europe and a few Americans. Mm-hmm. And now it's so we've got a much, much bigger market. Yeah. But, Chateau Petrus doesn't make any more wine. So and I think that's driven a lot. And then we've also had an extremely benign period economically, with very low interest rates, which has basically driven a lot of asset prices higher, including wine. Mm. And I think we're actually at the end of that. Mm. And I think that most of the time that I've been in the fine wine business, we've been in that particularly benign period.
Yeah. And now it's far less so. I mean, just more risk involved and not so much money to be made out of it?
I think that... I think we got ahead of. I think the whole thing was. The prices got ahead of themselves. I think the purpose of wine got lost. Mm. I think the idea of investment has become too central to speculation, but a lot of that was driven by two things really. One was cheap money, and the other was demographics. Mm. And I think demographics is destiny. If you look at Bibendum started at the beginning of the sort of the boom years of the baby boomers. And that, so we had this enormous sort of following wind of growth of just sheer numbers of people. And now we're at the point where I'm a median baby boomer at 72. Mm. So, and basically we're going away.
You're looking to sell wine basically, or drink it. Really.
Yeah. I mean, there's masses of wine that's been bought on primeur since the early 80s, which is still sitting in bonded warehouses here and around the world, and it's increasingly looking for an exit at a time when there isn't much demand for new on primeur, and so I think we're a lot of the sort of the froth on the upside is going to be given back on the way down, and I think we are going to go through a period of sort of grinding it out.
Does that make it a buyer's market in a sense?
Yes, I think it does.
Yeah. And is there still a place for Bordeaux en primeur? Do you think, the most recent campaign's not been a success, has it really? The 2024s?
Well, I think the problem is that the origins of it really were financing the harvest, way back in, as far back as sort of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, but it grew into, particularly in the sort of the early 80s onwards, it grew into this speculative activity, and increasingly the producers sort of wanted to take their share of the final market price.
Yeah,
and they left increasingly less and less on the table for people to finance the journey.
Yeah.
And I think while there was always a greater fool to sell it to, it was fine. And when money cost nothing to borrow, the cost of money was nothing. It was easy to keep going. But now we have real interest rates, and the time value of money now is a thing. And so, for most people, if something's not going up by at least 7% a year, in 10 years, it's got to double just to cover the cost of money. So, and we're starting for a place where basically the starting point is too high.
The pricing.
My personal view is that yes, en primeur needs to go back to it can re-emerge, but it needs to be driven much more by fundamentals. I think we've got to go back to the point where you have the cost price of wine plus some incentive amount, and then that becomes the price that is given to the market.
Yeah, because it used to be said that you could buy, say, 2 cases of Chateau Giscourt and the wine would go up in value because you bought it cheap or at an advantageous price, and then you could sell one and you paid to drink the other, basically. I mean, but that's not true anymore, is it?
Well, the theory doesn't work because you can now buy 96, you can buy sort of completely mature Bordeaux cheaper than you can buy the new stuff. So
doesn't make sense.
With no risk.
And what about consumers? I'm going to talk to you about South Africa in a minute. I just want to know, do you think consumers have become more adventurous? I mean, are they less interested in laying wines down at the same time?
I think younger generations are less scared of wine. I think, we were very kind of hidebound by what we were told, what we were told was right. And I think that my guess, their relationship inevitably, like ours was, will be different to the prior generation.
Yeah.
But I think I think they're not as interested in the aspirational aspects of wine that we were sort of led to be.
Yeah.
I don't think they see it so much as sort of an indicator of prestige or status and so on. I think that's not interesting to them. I think what's interesting to them is increasingly what interests them in everything else, which is they want to know more about, they're curious about an interesting world, and they're curious about things they don't know. And the idea of having a bottle of something that comes from somewhere made by somebody interesting in an interesting way that shares some of the values that they do is something which is enhancing to an occasion with friends or family.
And how should the wine business engage with those new consumers? By telling stories, in a sense, but provenance.
I think it's about authenticity. I think the two fundamental things which, the one is really lacking and the other is increasingly valued, and one is that the thing that's really lacking is trust. Yeah. And the second is authenticity. And I think we've got to stop. We've stopped talking about things being driven and being marketed, and all that kind of jargon. We've got to get back to the very simple building blocks of what wine is, and it is about people and place, it's about, and its utility in sort of in economic terms is essentially, as I said, as it has been since sort of the Georgians first invented the query, is basically sitting around a table breaking bread with friends and family, with a glass of wine. And it's not about booze. It's not about It's not about being more important than, or being richer than the next person. It's been a fundamental. It's bread, oil, and wine. It goes to the heart and the bake. And I think we need to recover that. And it's not about how do I make more money and and it's not about massive growth. And I think also I just don't think that the huge volume we have of wine today, I don't think most of it's sustainable. On economically or climatically. So I think that I think the wine category is going to become a much smaller thing. I think an awful lot of the wine category, the base of the pyramid, isn't terribly vinous anyway. So it's not really a good choice for a younger generation that's got lots of choice, frankly.
Yeah. I wanted to you mentioned place, and one of the places you're involved in, and I know it well and love it, is a place called Seine, which is in South Africa. It's in the Bordeaux River. I think it was a former ostrich farm, wasn't it? How did you get involved? How did you get involved in that? Because it's an unbelievable place. Was that a risk getting involved with that? Were you involved with planting it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it was. It's like all. Most ventures in wine are risky, but so is everything, frankly. But I've known David since when I got off about one of the first planes in 1994 that when it was acceptable to go down there. Yeah. And I met him that trip, and I turned up at his place the day before his wedding, which didn't endear me to his wife Rita, but we've since made up. But and so I've known him a long time, and I was his first importer at Bibendum. And he's always been a good friend, and he found this place when he was just having a weekend down on the Bordeaux River in Malchas, and he said, "This is a fascinating piece of land." He said it's like the Douro meets Châteauneuf-du-Pape, and I just think this is, and I'm so curious to see what one could do here.
And it's made amazing wines,
Yeah, and so we, and then the idea was to take sort of warm varietals from the northern hemisphere and put them in a cool part of the southern hemisphere, and do it very simplistic. We got sort of these big pudding stones on schist, as and it's sort of bush vine, produces horribly low yields. Yeah, sort of 3 tons a hectare or something. Yeah. If we're lucky, very low rainfall, which is very little technology. We built a winery basically out of the stones from the vineyard, and as you've seen, and but putting together that kind of mix, it was all risk because none of it had sort of been done before in that way, and no one had ever planted vines anywhere near there. I think 40k was the nearest vineyard. But actually we made a couple of barrels of 07, 2-3 years after we planted, 3 years after we planted, and it was good. And it's still, I still got some. It's still, It's still there.
Next time I see you, we're going to open one of those. I'd like to
we'll
try
have a bottle, exactly.
Yeah.
You know, and it's, you know, and we put a winery there in 2015, and that really upped the game, because then we could really, you know, it's all about
fine-tune it. Yeah.
And I think, you know, what we've discovered really is it's a place which is absolutely, you know, I mean, it's a cliche, but it really is about the vineyard, and that is just a unique piece of terroir. And you know, you like it or you hate it, and some people won't like it.
And the thing is, you know, you never really know until you planted the grapes and as you fermented the first wines. Really, you know, I mean, you can do all the soil science you want and dig as many, you know, pits as you want, but if the wine doesn't stack up, it doesn't stack up, right? No,
and I think, you know, we took you know, you made life even easier for ourselves by then producing blends, which are notoriously difficult to communicate to people. But I think it was the right thing to do if we take the long view. And we've also added in, you know, lots of pepper and salt into the mix. You know, we're planting Ascetica, and we've got Vermentino and Verdelho. And, you know, we managed to get the right plant material of Grenache Noir, which is now about 11% of the blend. And actually, you know, we now want double that because it, you know, so it's an early, but you know what one has to understand about wine, and it's true in all areas of it, is that it's a long, slow process. You know, you have to accept that you're going to, yes, it's risky, but if you take the view that you're planting an oak and you probably won't see much of, you won't get much shade of it in your lifetime, then that's kind of how wine is. But you embrace the sort of the journey as the destination. And I think that's the way to think about it. That's the way we think about it.
I like that idea. One of your other great loves, which I share, the wines of Piemonte. Again, you're talking about wines that need time. Tell us about this other business you're involved in, which is Nebbia and Luce. So Nebbia being fog, obviously, and which is where the word Nebbiolo comes from, and Luce being light, right? Just tell us about, because you store old wine, you store wines, you buy them on primeur or young?
Yeah, so I had this idea about it 9 years ago. That you know, when I joined the wine trade in the UK, you know, the thing that I think the wine merchants added most value doing was basically being stockholders. And also I think that was an enormous value to the producers, because essentially they became the sort of financiers of that journey. And so I remember sitting down to lunch with the buyer at Berry's in 1976, and he was agonizing about whether to put a 10-year-old Petit Chateau Bordeaux on the list yet.
Yeah.
That they had sitting in there, you know, and that was a very different era. You fast forward to today, and no one has any stock. And you go into any restaurant anywhere, and you see a list of all the growers' wines you want to drink, but all of them been bottled last Tuesday.
Yeah,
you know, and that's a shame. And if you see old bottles, they're either too expensive or you've got to worry about the provenance. So I thought to myself, well, you know, actually, if I want to find a competitive edge, if I stick myself out on the timeline, I'm probably going to be in a crowd of one. And
a bit like the champagne business you did, in a way. You saw a niche and thought, okay, go for that. Yeah. So you sell 10-year-old wines or more, right?
Yes. Also, I was getting very bored of this kind of faster and faster world, you know, and the whole sort of cycle, and everything was driven by this kind of running everything hot, you know. And I thought to myself, well, you know, wine doesn't really work. It doesn't work best like that. So, you know, if we can find a way of, you know, going to producers, you know, buying on release, finding somewhere to hold these wines for an average of 5 years in Piemonte's case, because that gives you wine that's roughly 10 years old, which I think is sort of approaching sort of full maturity. And you work out a model whereby you can make your normal margin as a sort of like an importer does, and then you add the cost of doing that, and you do that as efficiently as possible. You can end up with mature wine that's got great provenance and that's really honestly priced.
Yeah.
And also, in a way, I mean, I talked to one very nameless but extremely famous small producer in Bordeaux, and he said, you know, look, you know, I don't mind the fact that, you know, I sell my wine, you know, at sort of 40 euros, but it's, you know, and then my importer sells it for 200, because otherwise, you know, because the market then, you know, he said, I don't mind them making money. My problem is that, you know, a lot of the people who ought to be drinking my wine can't afford it anymore. You know, so actually the idea of holding, you know, going through this sort of speculative time where, you know, which is where the wine is sort of maturing but not being drunk. Yeah. And it's just being traded around like so much, so many tokens, I think is, you know, to get away from that, I think is quite interesting.
And what's your website for that particular business?
It's called nebbieluce.com.
Okay, well, that's easy to remember, isn't it?
Yeah, and we're just beginning to start. I mean, so it's been a long. I've always said to my wife, we've got incredibly good cash flow. The trouble is, it's all the wrong way. But we've got so we've got I'm now I'm officially irresponsibly long Piemonte, and
okay,
but it doesn't go off. I think that's what one. I love the region, and I've also got. It's also because I have a different time preference.
Mm.
And I'm lucky to have the savings to be able to do this without having to go and try and talk to a bank manager that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And I can take the time to do things where I've got time to try and find an argument for why you would want to buy this. So I thought, and I've seen, things like Alto Piemonte as being probably more interesting and more of the future than the Langhe was. I mean, in the 19th
which is
century,
where Barolo and Barbaresco are, right? Basically. So you're
exactly.
looking at other regions outside the classics in a way.
Yeah, I mean, Alto Piemonte in the 19th century was more famous and more prestigious than the Langhe.
Yeah.
I mean, there were 40,000 hectares up there, and now there are 400.
Yeah.
But there's a massive renaissance going on and fantastic. It's a bit like South Africa, the young, extremely kind of entrepreneurial and pioneering kind of producers. It's a completely different vibe up there with people.
Yeah, I mean, me, I love South Africa and think it's very exciting, and Spain too, actually. But I want to ask you a couple of things more. One is looking back over this amazing career you've had, 50 years where, began in Bordeaux and you're still busy now with Piemonte and Cru and everything. Yeah. Is there anything you'd have done differently?
I mean, I think not. I mean, I'm a great believer that. I mean, you cock up a lot of things, and you did, and I think I spent. I spent too long. I think Bibendum grew hugely, and I became non-exec actually in 2000. I mean, I always used to say that I'm a very quick learner eventually. In that, I realized that by 2000, I was actually crap at running things, really. I was quite good at ideas, but I wasn't very good at running things. And there were much better people, and also enjoyed it. I found that I'd spent too long on, something on a machine that just wanted to grow for its own sake. And I just found that the problem when you grow a business too much like wine is you end up with having to sell the things you don't really want to sell to the people you probably aren't that interested in.
Yeah.
Because that's how one divides into the other. And I now wish I'd spent less time. I wish I'd had the opportunity to buy out the fine wine division of Bibendum earlier.
And step outside it earlier. Really.
And because getting back to something more human scale was, when we started Bibendum, we did lots of really exciting things. And we did the first Rhone en primeur. I think we did the first Burgundy en primeur. We did lots of really interesting fine wine stuff.
Yeah.
And when we had a shop there as well, it was we had a fantastic vibrant community of consumers. And
it was an amazing place, actually. I mean, I can remember some great times there, basically, with you and Willie Liebus and other people, really.
Ben,
the final question I always ask people this is, how do you get away from wine? I know you've got grandkids, so you don't strike me as somebody who leads a sedentary life. I mean, I think you still go into work, do you, every day or not?
Well, I sort of work. I work remotely. I mean, I do have an office for Nebier Luce down in Bermondsey, but the trouble is that when I go there, I start gassing on, and then productivity dips. So I try and sort of eke it out. But I spend a lot of time. I mean, I don't. I don't fancy retiring. I think the key thing as you get older is to have more control of your time.
Yeah.
I think that's because time, you suddenly realize, again, sort of being the quick learner eventually, you've suddenly realized that is actually the only wealth. And so I want to spend my time doing more variety of things. I mean, I spent a lot of time in the sort of 15 years up to COVID doing a lot of long distance sailing. I mean, I sailed to Greenland, and in fact, the last big one we did a massive sail up through Norway up to Svalbard, which is 600 miles north, and into some polar bears and so on. So I did, we did 40,000 miles, I think we did in 15 years. And
that's the kind of thing you remember forever, much more than the last en primeur tasting you went to.
Yeah, we never went to the Med or, stood around with martinis. You know, it was proper uncomfortable. We even actually did them. The worst thing I ever did outside wine was to sail to Antarctica from Ushuaia. that was horrible. It was a month of sheer hell. I'm so thrilled I went, but I never again.
Yeah, I like that. Very true what you say, that I think time is the only wealth. Anyway, listen, Simon, thank you so much for spending time with me, chatting about your amazing 50-year career. We could talk way more. And next time I see you, we're going to have one of those early bottles of Seine, and I'll bring along something that the Molyneux made very early on in their career at Talbot Mountain Vineyards. So let's catch up. Let's have dinner very soon.
Love to do that. Great.
See you, my friend.
All right, Tim. Cheerio.
Bye.
Bye.
What a pleasure to look back over Simon's rich and varied career, and I enjoyed his line in self-deprecation. Next week on Cork Talk, my guest is Natasha Hughes, Master of Wine, who'll be talking to me about her new book about Beaujolais. Join me then. Thanks for listening to Cork Talk. If you want to read more reports, articles and tasting notes by me, go to my website, timatkin.com. You can also follow me on Twitter @TimAtkin and on Instagram @TimAtkinMW. See you next week.